I was standing in my aunt's kitchen, balancing a paper plate of cranberry ham and mashed potatoes when my cousin said, "Your parents hosted such a cozy Christmas dinner last night." The words hit harder than the freezing wind outside Spokane. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her, that she'd said something else. But then she laughed, scrolling through her phone and showing me a photo my mother, in her emerald green sweater, smiling next to a glowing Christmas tree I had bought last year. My father stood behind her carving roast beef with that same proud grin he wore every December, and beside them, my younger brother Ethan was holding a mug of cocoa like he belonged to a perfect Hallmark card. I felt the fork slip from my hand and hit the plate with a metallic clatter that turned every sound around me hollow. I had driven 9 hours from Denver to surprise them with gifts and wine, imagining Mom's face lighting up when she saw me at the door. Turns out I was the surprise. They'd celebrated Christmas without even telling me. The room buzzed with laughter and the faint hum of a holiday playlist. My aunt's kitchen smelled of cinnamon and sugar candles flickering against frosted windows. Kids darted down the hallway, giggling, their socks sliding on the wood floor. Everything was warm, golden familiar, and I felt like I'd stumbled into someone else's life. I forced a small smile and shifted closer to the counter, pretending to adjust my plate. My cousin, sweet, oblivious Emily, kept talking, her voice light. "It was so nice. Your mom said you were probably too busy with work to make the trip up. Oh, and that roast she made, amazing. Everyone came." Her words blurred together. Too busy. That was her excuse. The one mom fed everyone so she wouldn't have to admit I hadn't been invited. I felt my chest tighten as I set my plate down. The Christmas lights above the window twinkled against the reflection of my face, calm on the surface but trembling underneath. I mumbled something about needing to find my aunt and walked out of the kitchen, heart thudding against my ribs. In the hallway, the laughter dimmed. The scent of gingerbread still hung in the air, but it made me nauseous. I pulled my phone from my purse. No calls, no texts, nothing from Mom or Dad, not even a casual "wish you were here." My reflection stared back from the dark screen, tired eyes, a forced smile that didn't belong to me. "They just forgot," I whispered. But I knew better. Mom didn't forget things. She planned, polished, perfected. She'd been the kind of woman who sent handwritten thank you notes and labeled every storage bin in the garage. Forgetting wasn't in her vocabulary. This wasn't an oversight, it was a choice. Through the living room window, I could see my parents' Christmas card pinned to my aunt's corkboard. I recognized the photo immediately. It was one I'd taken last December, right before leaving for a late shift at the office. They were standing in front of the same tree I'd bought and decorated myself, the one I'd stayed up until 2 a.m. wrapping in gold ribbon because Mom's back hurt. They'd used my photo for their family Christmas card. A brittle laugh escaped me. I had built that picture-perfect image, and now I wasn't even part of it. I stepped outside, pretending to take a phone call. The air hit me like a slap. Snow fell in soft, relentless flurries, coating the driveway and the rows of mailboxes lining the street. Across the road, a plastic Santa swayed in the wind, its smile cracked under layers of frost. I pulled my coat tighter and tried to breathe, but the air was too sharp. My car was parked at the corner, already dusted white. I thought about just leaving, driving back to Denver, letting the heater hum until the ache in my chest went numb, but my legs wouldn't move. I leaned against the porch railing and stared at the night sky. The stars were faint behind thick clouds, but I could still see the glow from downtown in the distance. "Too busy," I whispered again, tasting the bitterness in my mouth. That was how she erased me, politely, efficiently, with a smile. I remembered last Christmas how I'd stayed home from a ski trip to help her decorate, how I'd paid for Ethan's ticket so he could visit, how Mom had said, "You're always so good to us, Grace. You make everything easy." Back then, I thought she meant it as love. Now it felt like a warning I hadn't understood. Easy meant invisible. Easy meant disposable. I went back inside long enough to grab my bag. My aunt called after me, asking if I'd stay for dessert, but I told her I had an early drive. Her warm smile stung more than the cold. "Drive safe, honey," she said, squeezing my arm. I nodded, forcing a grin. Always, in the car, the steering wheel was freezing under my fingers. I started the engine, and the radio came to life with a cheerful voice singing, "Have yourself a merry little Christmas." I shut it off instantly. My throat ached, but no tears came. Just that heavy silence pressing against my ribs. The road out of town was empty, the world glazed in white. Every house I passed glowed with colored lights and silhouettes of families gathered around tables. Through one window, I saw a woman laughing as a man kissed her cheek. Another house had kids jumping on a couch in matching pajamas. Each one looked like a world I no longer belonged to. Halfway down the highway, I pulled into a rest stop and parked under a flickering streetlight. My phone buzzed with a notification: Ethan's Instagram story. I hesitated before opening it. A boomerang of him clinking glasses with mom and dad, captioned "Family Time." Nothing better. I stared until the screen blurred. I locked the phone and set it face down on the passenger seat. My hands were trembling now, not from the cold, but from the weight of what that word family had become. I had built their comfort, paid their bills, sent them gifts, covered every emergency, and somehow I was still the outsider. The heater hummed, filling the car with a soft mechanical sound that felt almost like a heartbeat. I leaned back, eyes stinging, and whispered, "They didn't forget me, they excluded me." The difference was sharp as ice. Snow started falling harder, tapping against the windshield in tiny bursts. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating endless flakes swirling like dust. I watched them, thinking how easy it was to disappear, how silent the world became once you stopped trying to be seen. For a long while, I just sat there, breathing in the faint scent of pine air freshener, listening to the engine idle. Then, slowly, a strange calm began to settle. Beneath the hurt, beneath the disbelief, there was a small, quiet pulse of something else: resolve. I reached for my phone again and opened my banking app out of habit. My parents' names glowed across the list of automatic payments, mortgage, utilities, car insurance. I'd set them up years ago, never questioning it. The numbers rolled down the screen like a confession I'd never written. My thumb hovered over the edit button. I didn't press it. Not yet. But in that moment, I knew something had shifted. The girl who'd driven 9 hours to surprise her parents was gone. The woman sitting in the dark watching snow bury the world outside was someone different. "I'm done being easy," I whispered. The words fogged the cold air like smoke, then disappeared into the silence. I turned off the headlights and sat in the dim orange glow of the dashboard until my reflection blurred. My hands steadied. The road ahead stretched into nothing but black and snow. Somewhere past it, Denver waited, quiet and clean and mine. As I pulled back onto the highway, the clock on the dashboard flicked to midnight. Christmas Day was over. So was the version of me who thought being good was the same as being loved. What I decided that night would change everything they thought they could take for granted. The morning light crept through the blinds, thin and gray against the frost that had gathered overnight. The city was silent, as if Denver itself was holding its breath. I hadn't slept more than an hour. My phone sat on the counter, black, and still, like it was waiting for me to admit something. I poured a cup of coffee that tasted like metal and stared at the screen, replaying my cousin's words in my head. "Your mom said you were probably too busy." Too busy to be her daughter, I thought. Too far to be family. The phone felt heavy in my hand. I scrolled to Mom's name, hesitated, then pressed call. She answered on the second ring, bright and cheerful, her voice full of that practiced sweetness she used when she wanted to sound innocent. "Hi, honey. Merry Christmas. How was your trip? Did you have a Christmas dinner last night?" There was a pause. I could hear the refrigerator door shut in the background, the hum of some TV show playing softly behind her. Then she said, almost too casually, "Oh, just something small, dear. You live so far away. I didn't want to pressure you." My stomach clenched. Pressure me to spend Christmas with my family. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that used to make me feel like a child being scolded. "Oh, Grace, don't make this a big deal. You work so hard and you're always tired. I thought it would be easier this way." That word easier hung in the air like smoke. Easier for who I swallowed hard. "Easier than what calling me sweetheart," she said in that tone. That always meant, "Stop. I didn't want you driving all that way in the snow just for one night. You know how worried I get." I looked out the window at the street below, at the people scraping ice off their cars, at a father helping his little boy zip up his coat. "You could have told me. I would have come." Mom sighed. "You take everything so personally. It's not about that. It's just things came together fast. Carol brought her pie, your father grilled, and before we knew it, the house was full. So full there wasn't room for me." "Grace," she said softly, warningly, "you're being dramatic." That word again. Dramatic. She'd said it when I cried after Dad's surgery, when I told her I was lonely after moving to Denver, when I finally asked why Ethan never helped with their bills. It was her way of trimming my pain down to something manageable, something she didn't have to look at. I breathed slowly. "You could have told me, Mom," I said again, my voice low. "I'm sorry you feel hurt," she said, perfectly polite. "I'll make it up to you soon, okay? We'll plan something." The word sorry landed like a paper feather light, meaningless, already gone. "Sure," I said, though I didn't mean it. There was silence. Then she tried to change the subject. "How's work? Still busy?" I almost laughed. "Yeah, still busy." Good, good, she said, relieved that we'd moved back to safe ground. "You're such a hard worker. You always were." I hung up before she could say anything else. The silence in my apartment felt loud. The clock ticked, the radiator hissed, and I stood there in the middle of my kitchen, the phone still in my hand, realizing I had just been managed, not loved. Snow drifted lazily outside the window. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass, closing my eyes. "Too far, too busy, too dramatic," I whispered. "Easier this way." The words tasted like rust. My coffee had gone cold. I dumped it into the sink and turned the tap on just to hear another sound besides my heartbeat. My hands shook slightly, but it wasn't anger. It was recognition. This wasn't new. It was just finally undeniable. A memory came back to me from last Thanksgiving. Mom had called the night before saying, "Don't worry about coming, honey. The roads are icy and you've been working so much." I'd stayed home that year thinking she was being thoughtful. Then she'd sent me a picture of the table, Ethan, his friends, two neighbors' laughter, spilling over the edges of my absence. That same photograph was still pinned on my fridge, the one I'd pretended didn't hurt. And before that, my 30th birthday. She'd mailed me a gift card with a note, "We'll celebrate next time you visit." But the visit never happened. There was always something: her back pain, Dad's schedule, Ethan's finals. Excuses layered over affection until I couldn't tell them apart. I picked up my phone again, scrolled to Dad's name, and called. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice warm but tired. "Your mom said you were upset. What's going on? Did you know about the Christmas dinner?" He hesitated. Yeah, of course. We figured you wouldn't want to drive all that way. It was just a last-minute thing." "You figured," I repeated, tasting the word. "Well, you're always busy, and the weather, Dad," I interrupted. "Stop. You could have just called." He sighed, the kind of weary sound that meant he wanted to end the conversation. "We just didn't want to make it harder, Grace. You know how your mom gets stressed about the holidays. We thought it would be easier for everyone." Easier. Again. My voice was quiet but steady. "Easier means without me." "Don't take it that way," he said quickly. "You know we love you." I waited, then asked, "Do you?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. He cleared his throat. "We're sorry if your feelings got hurt. Maybe next time, okay?" "Yeah," I said softly. "Next time." After we hung up, I stared at my reflection in the microwave door. Pale skin, dark circles, lips pressed together to hold back the words I'd never get to say. My father's love had always been quiet, but now it sounded like surrender. The clock ticked toward noon. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, leaving tire tracks through the slush. I pulled on my sweater and sat on the couch, the phone still beside me, screen black. I thought about every time they'd said easier when I offered to fly them out for my promotion party. And Mom said, "You don't need to fuss, honey." When I sent money for the house repairs and she told me, "You're such a blessing, but don't overextend yourself." They'd always wrapped rejection in politeness, making it sound like love. I picked up my notebook from the coffee table. It was the same one I used for work columns, lists, figures. Orderly, predictable. I opened to a blank page and wrote across the top in all caps the cost of easy. Underneath, I started listing every payment I'd made since 2016: mortgage, electricity, health insurance, Ethan's tuition, groceries. Each line felt like peeling away another illusion. My hands steadied as I wrote. I wasn't crying anymore. I was calculating. The kettle whistled faintly in the kitchen, and I poured myself another cup of coffee this time, letting it go cold on purpose. The air felt heavier, quieter, but there was a strange peace in it too, the peace that comes right before a decision. By late afternoon, the snow had stopped. Sunlight slipped through the clouds, glinting off rooftops and melting icicles. I stood by the window, notebook in hand, and whispered the phrase that had haunted me all morning. Too far, too busy. Then softer, not anymore. I sat down, opened my laptop, and stared at the list of autopay accounts still running under my name. Mortgage, utilities, gas, tuition. It was all there like a quiet heartbeat keeping their life alive. I didn't touch it. Not yet. But I felt the power of it, the weight of every dollar that had made their world possible. The phone buzzed again, Mom. I didn't answer. Her voicemail came through seconds later, her voice sugary but tight. "Honey, I hope you're not still upset. You know we love you. Let's not make this dramatic." I laughed softly. Dramatic. Always that word. When the voicemail ended, I wrote one final line beneath my notes. If I'm too far to invite, maybe I'm far enough to stop paying. The sun had nearly set when I closed the notebook. The sky outside glowed a pale gold before fading into blue. Somewhere, someone's house twinkled with Christmas lights, perfect and whole. Mine stayed dark, but for the first time in years, it felt like my own. I placed my phone face down, turned off the lamp, and let the quiet fill the room. For the first time, silence didn't sound like punishment. It sounded like possibility. The highway stretched ahead like a silver thread disappearing into the dark. Snow drifted across the windshield in fine, ghostly streaks, and the hum of the tires was the only sound left in the world. I told myself I just needed air, a drive to clear my head, but I knew better. I wasn't escaping the storm outside. I was escaping the one in my chest. The city lights of Denver faded in the rearview mirror until they looked like distant stars. The road climbed and twisted, each curve catching the glow of my headlights before swallowing it again. Every few miles I whispered one of their words like a mantra I hated: too far, too busy, easier this way. It was strange how quickly love could turn into a list of excuses. I remembered the first time my parents had asked for help. I'd just graduated from college, still believing adulthood meant freedom. My father called that winter, his voice light, almost embarrassed. "The shop's just a little slow this season, kiddo. Could you spot us a few hundred to get through the month?" I said yes, without hesitation, proud to be useful. He promised it was temporary. That was 9 years ago. By the time I turned 26, a few hundred had become just until we get back on our feet. When Mom's health insurance lapsed, I covered it. When the electric bill doubled during a cold snap, I sent the payment before they asked. They always sounded so grateful, so small on the phone, until gratitude became expectation. The wipers beat a steady rhythm against the glass, matching the pulse behind my eyes. The snow thickened, and the highway narrowed through a mountain pass. Somewhere between the white lines, the years began to blur together. I saw myself at 28, hunched over my laptop in a tiny apartment, transferring Ethan's tuition for the third time. He'd called the night before registration was due, his voice careless and confident. "You're the one with the good job, sis. I'll pay you back." He never did. I didn't even ask. I wanted to believe that being dependable made me indispensable. But all it did was make me invisible. The road leveled out again. I passed a sign for Pueblo, its letters glowing faintly through the snow. My gas light blinked on. I pulled into a rest stop, the kind that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 90s. The lights hummed overhead, harsh and yellow. I bought a burnt cup of coffee from the vending machine and stood outside watching the snow settle over the hood of my car. A trucker stood nearby, smoking his radio, playing a soft Christmas song. A few feet away, a young woman leaned against her car video, calling her parents. "Merry Christmas, I miss you guys." She laughed, her breath fogging the air. The screen on her phone glowed with the faces of people who actually looked happy to see her. I turned away and stared into the dark. The coffee tasted like metal, but it burned enough to make me feel alive. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Mom. "Hope you're not still upset, honey. Remember, we love you. Don't make this a big deal." I let the message sit unread. The trucker stubbed out his cigarette and climbed back into his cab. The girl drove off, still smiling at her phone. I stood alone under the buzzing light, whispering to myself, "They never wanted me. They wanted what I gave them." When I got back on the road, the silence felt heavier. The mountains rose dark against the sky, their shapes blurred by snow and shadow. I remembered the day my father had shown me his workshop, the smell of oil and sawdust, the sound of his old radio crackling with baseball commentary. He'd been sitting at his desk, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're a little behind," he'd said. "The bank's breathing down my neck. But don't worry, we'll sort it out." Mom had stepped in from the kitchen doorway, smiling softly. "You're part of this family business too, sweetheart. We'll make it right together." I'd felt proud then, needed important. But that same day, I'd seen an envelope half hidden beneath the bill's property tax delinquency notice. Dad had slid it under a pile before I could ask. I'd told myself it wasn't my place to pry. Now I knew better. The lie hadn't started this Christmas. It had been growing quietly for years, rooted in shame and watered by my willingness to believe. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, needing the motion, the speed, the proof that I could still move forward, even when everything behind me was crumbling. The sky was turning pale at the edges, a thin line of blue pushing against the black. By the time exhaustion hit, I was somewhere outside Trinidad. A small roadside motel glowed in the distance, like a match struck in the dark. I pulled into the lot, parked under a flickering sign that read vacancy, and stumbled inside. The clerk didn't even look up when I paid. The room smelled like pine cleaner and something older, loneliness maybe. I dropped my bag on the bed and sat for a long time, listening to the hum of the heater. My fingers itched for something to do. I pulled out my black notebook, the one I used for work, and opened it to a blank page. At the top, I wrote in small, steady letters, "The cost of easy." I started listing everything again, not as dollars, but as years. Mortgage, 8 years. Utilities every winter. Health insurance, 6 renewals. Ethan's tuition, 2 degrees, 1 diploma that isn't mine. Mom's prescriptions, Dad's shop, bills, the endless stream of little emergencies that had become my responsibility. The ink bled slightly into the paper. I stared at the words until they blurred, then added one more line beneath them. "This isn't love, it's labor." My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. The tears had dried up somewhere between Denver and the mountain pass. All that was left was a strange calm, the kind that comes after you finally stop pretending something can be fixed. I turned off the lamp and lay on the bedshoes, still on, staring at the ceiling. The faint light from the sign outside flashed red, then dark, then red again, in a slow rhythm that almost felt like breathing. For a moment, I thought about calling Nora, my friend from work, the only person who ever asked about my family without expecting a cheerful answer. But it was too late, and I didn't know what I would say. They forgot me. It sounded childish, but it was true. When the heater clicked off, the silence felt thick enough to touch. I rolled over and opened the notebook again. The words looked smaller now, almost harmless, but they weren't. They were proof. Under the last line I wrote something new, deliberate, each letter pressed hard into the page. If I stopped, they'd fall apart. Then below that, maybe they need to. The first light of dawn spilled through the thin curtains, painting the room in pale gold. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the world was quiet in that way only mornings after storms can be. I sat up slowly, feeling the ache in my shoulders ease. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The parking lot was empty except for my car dusted with frost. The sun hit the windshield, and for a moment, it gleamed so brightly I had to look away. If I disappeared tomorrow, I thought the only thing they'd miss is my bank account. The realization didn't hurt. It just settled into me like truth always does, heavy, unyielding, but freeing. I closed the notebook, slipped it back into my bag, and grabbed my keys. The engine sputtered to life, and I sat there, hands on the wheel, watching my breath fog the air. When I finally pulled back onto the highway, the sun was rising behind me, turning the snow into sheets of light. I wasn't driving to escape anymore. I was driving toward a decision that had already been made somewhere between the phone call and the silence that followed. By the time I reached Denver again, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The morning light slipped through the blinds like a quiet apology. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the streets outside polished and white. My apartment was still. The coffee from yesterday sat cold in the pot, and the notebook I'd left open on the table glared up at me with a line scrawled across it in heavy ink, the cost of easy. I sat at the kitchen counter, wrapped in a blanket, staring at those words. My phone was silent. No calls, no messages, no emergencies waiting to be solved. It felt wrong, like waking up in someone else's life. For years, every morning had started with someone needing something. Today, there was only me. The heater clicked on with a low hum. I made fresh coffee, though I didn't taste it, and opened my laptop. The light from the screen reflected in the window pale blue against the snow outside. I logged into my bank account, fingers trembling just enough to make me angry. The page loaded, and there it was, the quiet evidence of my servitude. Mortgage. $2,050 divided by month since 2017. Utilities, $480 automatic draft tuition, $9,200 divided by semester health insurance, recurring every 30 days, 4 lines that had defined nearly a decade of my life. I scrolled further. Groceries, maintenance, pharmacy payments. The numbers blurred together, a digital graveyard of every time I'd said yes instead of help yourself. I pressed my fingertips against my temples. The list felt endless, but it was the silence between each transaction that hurt the most. The silence where gratitude should have lived. The cursor blinked at me like a heartbeat. I clicked View Payment History, and the archive unfolded year by year. 8 years of loyalty disguised as love. I remembered the first time I set it up. Dad had just retired early from his mechanical shop. His voice on the phone was cheerful but strained. "It'll just be a few months, kiddo. We're getting used to the new routine." Mom had taken the phone then. "You've always been good with numbers, Grace. If you could just set up something automatic, we won't have to bother you every time. Only until we catch up." I'd smiled at the time, sitting cross-legged on my apartment floor with my laptop open and a cup of tea beside me. I'd typed in their account numbers, entered my card information, and hit Enable Recurring Payment. I remember how proud I'd felt, like I was finally the adult my parents could rely on. I'd told myself it meant we were a team. Now, staring at the same interface years later, I realized I'd been the team, the only player. I closed the laptop and reached for my notebook. The black cover was smooth under my hand, almost comforting. I flipped to a clean page and wrote at the top in steady letters what I pay for and why. One by one, I listed them again, but this time I added the truth beside each one. Mortgage, their home, not mine. Utilities, comfort they never shared with me. Tuition, Debt for a future that isn't mine. Health insurance. The price of their peace of mind. The words looked sterile on the page, but each one burned as it formed. I drew circles around them until the ink began to bleed. I whispered, "Every number has a story. Every dollar has a wound." The sound of my own voice startled me. It felt foreign, too calm, too certain. A notification pinged on my phone. For a second, my heart jumped, thinking maybe it was Nora. But it wasn't. It was Ethan. "Thanks again for covering tuition, sis. You're literally saving me. You're the best." I stared at the message, my throat tight. Before I could even set the phone down, another text came in. "Mom says hi. She's making soup for Dad." The absurdity of it hit me so hard I laughed, one sharp, humorless sound that echoed in the quiet apartment. I typed a reply, then deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. Finally, I put the phone face down. For years, I'd been the invisible net that caught everyone when they fell. They didn't see me. They just trusted the ground would never give way. Not this time. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city gleamed under the winter sun, every rooftop sparkling. I could see a couple across the street carrying groceries, laughing, their breath visible in the cold. I wondered if they knew how lucky they were to be loved for who they were, not what they gave. My eyes fell on the notebook still open on the counter. The words I'd written looked like confessions, the kind that could never be spoken aloud. I tore out one of the old pages filled with expenses from years ago. The paper felt heavy, greasy, with the oil of my own fingerprints worn from being touched too many times. I carried it to the sink, struck a match, and held the flame beneath the corner. The fire caught quickly, curling the edges inward. The smell of burnt ink and paper filled the air. I watched until the page folded in on itself, black and crumbling, before turning on the tap to wash the ashes down the drain. "You built your comfort on my silence," I whispered. The reflection in the window watched me back, pale, tired, but steady. The woman staring at me didn't look weak. She looked finished. I went back to my laptop, reopening the bank tab. My finger hovered over autopay settings. The cursor blinked beside the word edit. It would take 3 clicks, 3 tiny movements to end everything. I didn't press them yet. I just stared, letting the possibility fill the air like static. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. My coffee had gone cold again. I picked up the mug and carried it to the sink, setting it down beside the ashes. My reflection in the faucet looked like a stranger, someone I hadn't met yet but wanted to. By evening, the apartment was dark. I hadn't turned on a single light. I liked it that way. The glow from my laptop screen was enough. I sat at the table, notebook open again, pen hovering. My hand shook slightly as I wrote the next line. "They think love means dependency. I'll teach them what absence feels like." The sound of my phone vibrating on the counter broke the silence. Mom, this time. I didn't move to answer. Her name lit up the screen, faded, then lit up again. Finally, the ringing stopped, replaced by a voicemail notification. I pressed play out of habit. Her voice came through, soft and rehearsed. "Honey, it's me. I just wanted to check in. You've been quiet. I hope you're not still upset. You know we love you. Don't make this bigger than it is." Her words used to make me feel small. Tonight they made me feel nothing. I closed the voicemail and picked up the pen again. The next sentence came easier. "Silence isn't punishment, it's power." The room grew colder as the night deepened. I pulled my blanket tighter and sat there listening to the wind rattle the windows. Somewhere far away, a siren wailed and faded. My phone buzzed again, another text from Mom. "Love you, sweetheart. Call when you can." I didn't reply. I flipped to the next page of the notebook and wrote one final line, pressing the pen hard enough to leave grooves in the paper. "Tomorrow, I stop being the good daughter." I underlined it twice. When I finally stood up, my legs felt steady. I walked to the window and watched as a few late snowflakes drifted down, landing softly on the glass before melting. The streetlights below flickered, the world looking almost peaceful again. In the reflection, I saw myself holding the notebook close to my chest. My face looked calm, not vengeful, not bitter, just decided. Tomorrow everything would change, but tonight the silence was mine. The phone started ringing before sunrise. The sound cut through the quiet like a blade sharp and insistent, pulling me out of sleep. For a second I thought it might be work, but when I reached for it, the name on the screen made my stomach tighten. Mom. I didn't answer. I let it ring until the sound faded and the apartment fell silent again. Then it buzzed once more, Dad this time. Then Ethan. The same name cycling through like a broken clock. I stared at the screen, the glow cold and pale against the dark room. For years I'd jumped at every call. Now I let the noise pass right through me. When it finally stopped, I got up, poured coffee, and sat by the window. The world outside was still gray, the kind of winter light that made everything look suspended. The phone vibrated again on the counter, persistent, desperate. I ignored it and took a slow sip. The first voicemail arrived a few minutes later. Mom's voice, sweet and careful. Sweetheart, I think the bank called this morning. Maybe your payment didn't go through. Can you check when you have time? I deleted it before she finished speaking. The second came right after, her tone sharper now. Honey, please check on it. They'll charge late fees if it's not fixed today. I set the phone face down on the counter and turned on the faucet. The sound of running water drowned her out. I wasn't angry, just done. I made toast, washed the mug, and moved through my morning like it was any other day. Ordinary life felt strange but good. For the first time, I was living for no one but myself. A third voicemail buzzed in. Dad. His voice was calm, practiced. Hey kiddo, your mom's worried. Don't stress her out. Can you just handle this? It'll be easier for everyone. That word again. Easier. I closed my eyes and let the word echo. It used to make me comply, now it made me smile. It already is, I whispered. I deleted the message. An hour later, another call. Ethan. I didn't pick up, but his voicemail played automatically. His tone was casual, oblivious. Hey sis, the school emailed me. Something about delayed tuition payment. Can you fix that? I've got finals this week? He didn't even say please. I almost laughed. It was so absurd, so normal. The expectation ran so deep. He didn't realize what he was asking. I imagined his face when he realized there was no safety net. No invisible sister to save him from his own deadlines. I typed a reply, "You're old enough to handle your own life," then deleted it. My silence would say more than any text ever could. By late morning, the apartment was filled with light. I opened the windows just enough to let in the cold air. The phone kept buzzing on the counter, a mosquito that refused to die. I turned on the radio, soft jazz, a station I used to play when I worked late at the office. The saxophone drowned out the vibration. I folded laundry, wiped the counter, paid my own rent, checked client emails. Each task felt like a rebellion, an act of existing without being interrupted. For years, I'd associated noise with importance, calls, messages, requests. Now peace felt like proof of life. The phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. Mom again, her voice cracking this time. Grace, please call me back. The mortgage company said they'll send a notice. This is serious. We can't afford a late fee. Then Dad, not sure what's happening, but your mom's upset. Let's just fix this together. Then Ethan panicked now. They're freaking out, Grace. Just pay it, please. You always do. I stared at the screen until it went dark. They weren't calling me. They were calling their solution. I took another sip of coffee, the taste bitter but grounding. For the first time, I didn't feel like a daughter they'd made sure of that long ago. I felt like a creditor they'd lost track of. By afternoon, the calls blurred into one long sound. I left the phone on the table and let it buzz while I went about my day. The sound no longer stung. It became a rhythm I could live alongside, like wind through a window you never close all the way. At one point, I caught myself whispering. They taught me love was noise. I'll teach them silence. The words rolled off my tongue easily. They sounded right. I made lunch, cleaned the kitchen, sat at my desk finishing a report for work. The heater clicked softly, filling the apartment with warmth. For once, I didn't feel like a ghost haunting my own life. By evening, the light outside had dimmed to gold. The phone buzzed again, Mom, then Dad. I didn't look. The voicemails piled up one after another. Curiosity won out eventually, and I played one. Mom's voice trembled now. Grace, please, the mortgage company said they'll send a letter. The neighbors can't know about this. Just call me. Please. Neighbors. Not the money. Not the house. The shame. That was what she feared most. I deleted it without hesitation. Another voicemail came seconds later, Dad again. Not sure what's going on, but your mom's beside herself. Please, kiddo. We'll figure it out if you just come home. I turned off the phone. For a while, the apartment was quiet again. The only sound was the wind brushing against the window and the soft ticking of the wall clock. I stood at the counter, staring at my reflection in the glass. This should have made me feel powerful, but what I felt instead was peace. Steady, unwavering peace. I wasn't punishing them. I was releasing them from a lie they'd been living for years, and releasing myself from it too. Still, guilt lingered like smoke. It always did. It whispered, what if they can't handle it? What if they lose everything? I opened my notebook, the black one that had become my confessional, and wrote, if silence feels cruel, it's only because they never learned to listen. The act of writing steadied me. The guilt didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling me. When I looked up again, the sun had slipped behind the buildings. The sky outside was violet, and the snow on the rooftops caught the last of the light. My phone sat on the table, glowing faintly in the dim room. 40 missed calls, 5 voicemails, 2 new messages from the bank. I lit a candle on the counter, the flames small and still. The scent of cedar filled the air. I ladled soup into a bowl and sat at the table, eating slowly. The phone buzzed again, and I didn't even glance at it. The hum of the heater wrapped around me like a lullaby. By the time I finished dinner, the candle had burned halfway down. I pushed my chair back, picked up my pen, and wrote another line in the notebook. They built a world on my effort. Let them see what happens when I stop holding it up. I closed the book, exhaled, and let the silence expand until it touched every corner of the room. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, soundless, endless. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, watching flakes drift past the window, catching the glow of street lamps as they fell. My phone vibrated one last time on the table, the screen flashing with another name I didn't need to read. I whispered, let it fall, and turned it face down. The last thing I did before bed was open the notebook once more. I wrote in clean, deliberate handwriting, silence speaks louder than sacrifice. I blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward, vanishing into the quiet. And for the first time, I didn't dream of fixing anything. Just slept. The morning light was pale and metallic, the kind that makes everything look cold even when the heat is on. My phone buzzed somewhere under the pillow, the sound dull against the sheets. I didn't reach for it. It had been vibrating all night, and by now the noise barely registered. I lay still, eyes open, feeling the hum of silence underneath the chaos. When I finally sat up, the clock read 7:15. My apartment was filled with that early winter stillness that almost feels like snow waiting to fall. The air smelled like stale coffee from the pot I'd forgotten to empty. I stood stretched and stared at the phone lighting up again. Mom, then Dad, then Ethan. The rotation of their names was almost rhythmic, like they were taking turns knocking at a locked door. I didn't answer. I brewed fresh coffee, poured it black, and sat at the kitchen table. My notebook lay open beside my laptop. Yesterday's final sentence stared back at me. Silence speaks louder than sacrifice. I traced the letters with my fingertip, then flipped to a new page. I wrote one word at the top in sharp, deliberate strokes: today. I opened my laptop and signed into my bank account. The blue and white interface blinked up at me, impersonal and steady. My cursor hovered over the autopay settings tab. My pulse didn't race this time. I wasn't scared. I was ready. The first line read mortgage, $2.050 monthly, a decade of security I'd been paying for without living in. I clicked cancel. A pop-up appeared. Are you sure I clicked yes? The confirmation ping sounded softer than I expected, like a door closing gently. My shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. Next came utilities. $480 automatic draft. Cancelled. Then tuition. $9.200 per semester. Cancelled. Finally, health insurance, recurring every 30 days. Cancelled. Each confirmation tone felt lighter, quieter, as if the apartment itself was exhaling. When the last one disappeared from the screen, I sat back and whispered, "Now it's your turn to adjust." The phone buzzed almost immediately, as if the universe had been listening. I turned it over. Mom's text glowed at the top. "Honey, the power company called. Did your card expire?" "Love you." I stared at it for a few seconds, then set the phone back down. A minute later, another came. "Your father said the mortgage company sent a notice. Probably just a glitch. Can you check then, Ethan? Hey, the school's saying there's a balance. Is your account messed up or something?" I smiled faintly. They still couldn't imagine a world where I wasn't behind the curtain pulling levers. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, Denver looked washed clean, snow sparkling on rooftops, the air sharp and bright. For once, I didn't feel small against it. I felt free. The calls kept coming. I let them pile up. The apartment filled with the low, steady vibration of unanswered noise. I made breakfast. I cleaned the sink. I folded the blanket on the couch. The sound became background music, a reminder that I didn't owe anyone my attention. By noon, the sunlight had warmed the windows, turning the snow into thin rivers on the glass. I opened my notebook again and wrote, "Every system I built for them is offline. Now I get to build one for me." I wrote down the smallest things I wanted to do. Take a walk, buy groceries for myself, maybe visit Nora this weekend. Ordinary plans. The kind that didn't include saving anyone. The next message came through at 1:30. Mom again. "Honey, they said they'll charge a late fee if we don't pay by today. Please call me. I'm getting nervous." Then Dad. "Your mom's upset, Grace. Let's fix this together." Together. That word made my stomach twist. It had never been together. It had always been me. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. The radiator hissed softly in the corner. Outside, a single flake of snow drifted down past the window. The peace was fragile but real. I held on to it. By late afternoon, the voicemails began to sound different. The cheerful guilt was gone. What replaced it was panic. Mom's voice cracked. "Sweetheart, the mortgage company said they'll send a late notice. The neighbors will see. Please, Grace, I'm begging you. Just call." Dad's message followed. "Kiddo, not sure what's happening, but your mom's crying. She's scared. We just need to talk." "Okay then." Ethan again. "Grace, this isn't funny. The school said I can't register until the balance is paid. Why are you doing this?" I didn't answer any of them. I let the words exist without reply. For years they'd lived in comfort built on my silence. Now my silence had weight. It was the one thing they couldn't control. As evening settled, I lit a candle on the counter. The flame flickered low, throwing gold against the white walls. I poured a glass of wine, sat by the window, and watched the snow return. For a while I listened to the hum of the heater, the faint buzz of the phone, the city breathing quietly below. I realized I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel revengeful. I felt even, balanced. For every time they had drained me, I had finally given them the emptiness they'd earned. I opened the notebook again and wrote, "They used my silence to erase me. Now I'll use it to define myself." The pen moved easily this time, the words steady and sure. I looked at the candle and thought of how many nights I'd spent working late to cover their bills, telling myself it was love. How many mornings I'd woken up, exhausted, my phone buzzing with another problem to fix. Now the only sound was the slow crackle of the candle wick. Around 7, my phone buzzed again. I expected another voicemail from Mom or Dad. but the name that flashed on the screen made me pause. Nora, I answered immediately. Hey, she said. Her voice was calm, grounded a relief after a day of noise. You okay? Yeah, I said, exhaling. I did it. The payments, all of them. There was a pause, then a soft laugh. About damn time. I smiled, the kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep, somewhere new. I thought I'd feel bad. And do you? I looked at the window at the snow, swirling against the dark. No, I feel quiet. Good quiet or scary quiet, both, I said, but mostly good. That's peace, Grace. You've just forgotten what it sounds like. We talked for a while about work, about nothing. Ordinary conversation. The kind that didn't revolve around fixing something. When we hung up, I whispered, "This is what easy should feel like." The phone buzzed again minutes later, Mom's name lighting up the screen. I watched it ring, then fade, then ring again. I didn't pick it up. The candle burned lower, its flame steady and small. I reached for the notebook one last time and wrote, 3 clicks ended 8 years. That's all it took. I closed the book, the cover warm from my hands. Outside, the snow was falling thick again, muffling the city into silence. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the quiet hum of the heater. For once, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The phone vibrated once more, softer this time, like even it was tired of asking. I looked at the screen, glowing in the dark, Mom's name, then gone. I whispered to the still room, "Let them learn what silence really means." Then I blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward, vanishing into the soft dark, and the apartment sank into perfect, peaceful quiet. The candle from last night had melted into a shallow pool of wax. The air in my apartment smelled faintly of cedar and burnt wick. For the first time in days, my phone was quiet. I almost believed the storm had passed. Then it buzzed again. The sound was soft, but heavy, like a warning. I reached for it, half curious, half resigned. The first text came from Mom. "Honey, please call. Something's wrong with the bank. They froze the account." A second followed a moment later. "The electric bill was returned unpaid. Your father's shop is closed until further notice." I set the phone down and stared out the window. Snow drifted lazily through the air, soft and endless. Somewhere beneath that quiet beauty, my parents' world was cracking open. It didn't make me happy. It just felt inevitable. Another text flashed across the screen. "Please, Grace, call me. We need to fix this together." The word "together" made me laugh quietly. There had never been together. There had only been me. By mid-morning, the silence shattered again, not from my parents, but from people I hadn't heard from in years. A message from Mrs. Parker, Mom's friend from church. "So sorry about your parents, dear. Must be hard." I blinked at the screen. How did she even know? Then I understood. The news had spread. I pictured my mother's face, that polished smile she wore like armor cracking under the whispers of her perfect circle of friends. I could almost hear it, the pity, the gossip, the questions. It didn't bring me joy. It just confirmed what I'd always known. Truth doesn't stay hidden forever. I whispered to the empty room. You cared more about appearances than the people behind them. Around noon, my phone rang again. Dad. His name glowed on the screen, and this time I hesitated. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Grace," he said, voice low and hoarse like he'd been awake all night. "Your mom's... she's not doing great. The shop's been shut down. I didn't know they'd move this fast." I stayed quiet. He kept talking, filling the space between us. "They said we're behind 2 months. I thought you had it covered." There it was, the assumption, so casual, so complete. I could almost see him in the kitchen rubbing the back of his neck the way he did when pretending things were under control. "I stopped covering things that aren't mine," I said finally. The line went silent for a long beat. Then he sighed, a long exhale that sounded like surrender. "You made your point. No, Dad, I said softly. You made mine. He didn't argue. He just breathed quiet and defeated before hanging up. The moment I ended the call, a new text appeared. Mom, this time. People are asking questions at church. This is humiliating. How could you do this to us? I typed a reply, erased it, then typed again. Finally, I sent one line. You did this to yourselves. I just stopped hiding it. The typing dots appeared on the screen, blinking for several seconds, then vanished. No response. I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair. The heat from the radiator hummed softly, a steady rhythm that calmed me. For years, I had begged for acknowledgement, for any sign that they saw me as more than a convenience. And now silence was my answer and my peace. Still, a flicker of guilt pressed at the edge of my ribs. I tried to shake it, but it lingered stubborn and small. To quiet it, I opened my notebook. On a clean page, I wrote in dark ink. They taught me to measure love in debt. I'm just erasing the balance. The sound of wind rattled the window pane. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed and faded. I wondered if Mom was sitting at the kitchen table right now, clutching her phone, wondering why no one was saving her this time. My thoughts slipped backward to 2 years earlier, the last time I'd visited. The house had been spotless too, spotless. Every surface gleamed like a showroom, the kind of perfection Mom used to weaponize. We're doing fine, honey, she'd said, pouring tea into porcelain cups. The business is steady. Don't worry about us. But I had seen the pile of unopened mail on the counter. I'd seen the tension in Dad's jaw. Later that night, while they watched TV, I'd logged into my account and transferred another payment toward their mortgage. I never mentioned it. Neither did they. The house had never been stable. It was a facade I'd held up with every paycheck. Now, with my hands finally off it, the cracks were showing. It was already broken, I whispered. I just stopped holding it up. By afternoon, another voicemail arrived, this time from an unfamiliar number. I pressed play. This is a courtesy call from Redwood Mortgage Services, a woman's voice said politely. We're confirming that automatic payment services for account number ending in 714 have been discontinued. Default procedures will begin within 10 business days. I listened twice, then ended the call. My chest didn't tighten this time. There was no panic, just a strange calm that felt almost like freedom. Mom's next message came an hour later. They're coming to inspect the property next week. Your father can't stop them. Please, Grace, help us once. We'll fix it after. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then I whispered, That's what you said the first time. The light outside had shifted the sky, turning a muted blue-gray. I needed air. I grabbed my coat and walked to the corner cafe where Nora worked. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped inside. The smell of roasted coffee beans wrapped around me like warmth itself. Nora looked up from behind the counter and smiled. Hey, stranger. I sat at a small table near the window. She joined me a minute later with 2 steaming mugs. You look lighter, she said. Did you finally sleep? Some, I admitted. They're losing everything. Nora stirred her coffee, watching me carefully. How do you feel? I hesitated. Not good, not bad, just done. She nodded. You're not supposed to feel bad. You didn't ruin them. You stopped protecting their lie. I traced a circle in the condensation on my cup. It still feels cruel. It's not cruelty, Nora said gently. It's consequence. Her words sank deep, filling the cracks guilt had left behind. I didn't reply, but I smiled faintly. For the first time in years, I felt seen without being used. We talked about small things after that: work, plans, a new Thai restaurant that had opened downtown. Ordinary conversation, simple. The kind that didn't carry emotional landmines. When I got home, the sky had darkened to violet. My phone glowed on the table, notifications stacked high. 48 missed calls, 12 voicemails, 1 new text from Dad. We might lose the house. I set the phone face down and whispered, Then maybe you'll finally live honestly. The heater hummed as I lit another candle. Its glow softened the edges of the room, the light warm against the snow falling outside. I opened my notebook and wrote, "The collapse isn't punishment, it's truth revealing itself." The words felt final, like closing a chapter I'd been trapped inside for too long. I leaned back in the chair watching snowflakes gather on the windowsill. Their shapes melted against the glass before they could settle. My reflection stared back at me, calm, steady, unbroken. Outside, the city was quiet. Inside, I was too. For once, peace didn't feel like absence, it felt like beginning. The candle from last night had melted into a shallow pool of wax. The air in my apartment smelled faintly of cedar and burnt wick. For the first time in days, my phone was quiet. I almost believed the storm had passed. Then it buzzed again. The sound was soft but heavy, like a warning. I reached for it, half curious, half resigned. The first text came from Mom. "Honey, please call. Something's wrong with the bank." They froze the account. A second followed a moment later. "The electric bill was returned unpaid. Your father's shop is closed until further notice." I set the phone down and stared out the window. Snow drifted lazily through the air, soft and endless. Somewhere beneath that quiet beauty, my parents' world was cracking open. It didn't make me happy. It just felt inevitable. Another text flashed across the screen. "Please, Grace, call me. We need to fix this together." The word "together" made me laugh quietly. There had never been together. There had only been me. By mid-morning, the silence shattered again, not from my parents, but from people I hadn't heard from in years. A message from Mrs. Parker, Mom's friend from church. "So sorry about your parents, dear. Must be hard." I blinked at the screen. How did she even know? Then I understood. The news had spread. I pictured my mother's face, that polished smile she wore, like armor cracking under the whispers of her perfect circle of friends. I could almost hear it, the pity, the gossip, the questions. It didn't bring me joy. It just confirmed what I'd always known: truth doesn't stay hidden forever. I whispered to the empty room, "You cared more about appearances than the people behind them." Around noon, my phone rang again. Dad. His name glowed on the screen, and this time I hesitated. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Grace," he said, voice low and hoarse, like he'd been awake all night. "Your mom's... she's not doing great. The shop's been shut down." I didn't know they'd move this fast. I stayed quiet. He kept talking, filling the space between us. "They said we're behind 2 months. I thought you had it covered." There it was, the assumption, so casual, so complete. I could almost see him in the kitchen rubbing the back of his neck the way he did when pretending things were under control. "I stopped covering things that aren't mine," I said finally. The line went silent for a long beat. Then he sighed, a long exhale that sounded like surrender. "You made your point." "No, Dad," I said softly. "You made mine." He didn't argue. He just breathed quiet and defeated before hanging up. The moment I ended the call, a new text appeared. "Mom, this time, people are asking questions at church. This is humiliating. How could you do this to us?" I typed a reply, erased it, then typed again. Finally, I sent one line. "You did this to yourselves." I just stopped hiding it. The typing dots appeared on the screen, blinking for several seconds, then vanished. No response. I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair. The heat from the radiator hummed softly, a steady rhythm that calmed me. For years I had begged for acknowledgement, for any sign that they saw me as more than a convenience. And now silence was my answer and my peace. Still, a flicker of guilt pressed at the edge of my ribs. I tried to shake it, but it lingered, stubborn and small. To quiet it, I opened my notebook. On a clean page, I wrote in dark ink, "They taught me to measure love in debt. I'm just erasing the balance." The sound of wind rattled the window pane. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed and faded. I wondered if Mom was sitting at the kitchen table right now, clutching her phone, wondering why no one was saving her this time. My thoughts slipped backward to 2 years earlier, the last time I'd visited. The house had been spotless, too spotless. Every surface gleamed like a showroom, the kind of perfection Mom used to weaponize. "We're doing fine, honey," she'd said, pouring tea into porcelain cups. "The business is steady. Don't worry about us." But I had seen the pile of unopened mail on the counter. I'd seen the tension in Dad's jaw. Later that night, while they watched TV, I'd logged into my account and transferred another payment toward their mortgage. I never mentioned it. Neither did they. The house had never been stable. It was a facade I'd held up with every paycheck. Now, with my hands finally off it, the cracks were showing. "It was already broken," I whispered. I just stopped holding it up. By afternoon, another voicemail arrived, this time from an unfamiliar number. I pressed play. "This is a courtesy call from Redwood Mortgage Services," a woman's voice said politely. "We're confirming that automatic payment services for account number ending in 714 have been discontinued. Default procedures will begin within 10 business days." I listened twice, then ended the call. My chest didn't tighten this time. There was no panic. Just a strange calm that felt almost like freedom. Mom's next message came an hour later. "They're coming to inspect the property next week. Your father can't stop them. Please, Grace, help us once. We'll fix it after." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then I whispered, "That's what you said the first time." The light outside had shifted the sky, turning a muted blue-gray. I needed air. I grabbed my coat and walked to the corner cafe where Nora worked. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped inside. The smell of roasted coffee beans wrapped around me like warmth itself. Nora looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Hey, stranger." I sat at a small table near the window. She joined me a minute later with 2 steaming mugs. "You look lighter," she said. "Did you finally sleep?" "Some," I admitted. "They're losing everything." Nora stirred her coffee, watching me carefully. "How do you feel?" I hesitated. "Not good, not bad, just done." She nodded. "You're not supposed to feel bad. You didn't ruin them. You stopped protecting their lie." I traced a circle in the condensation on my cup. "It still feels cruel." "It's not cruelty," Nora said gently. "It's consequence." Her words sank deep, filling the cracks guilt had left behind. I didn't reply, but I smiled faintly. For the first time in years, I felt seen without being used. We talked about small things after that: work plans, a new Thai restaurant that had opened downtown. Ordinary conversation, simple, the kind that didn't carry emotional landmines. When I got home, the sky had darkened to violet. My phone glowed on the table, notifications stacked high. 48 missed calls, 12 voicemails, 1 new text from Dad. "We might lose the house." I set the phone face down and whispered, "Then maybe you'll finally live honestly." The heater hummed as I lit another candle. Its glow softened the edges of the room, the light warm against the snow falling outside. I opened my notebook and wrote, "The collapse isn't punishment, it's truth revealing itself." The words felt final, like closing a chapter I'd been trapped inside for too long. I leaned back in the chair, watching snowflakes gather on the windowsill. Their shapes melted against the glass before they could settle. My reflection stared back at me, calm, steady, unbroken. Outside, the city was quiet. Inside, I was too. For once, peace didn't feel like absence. It felt like beginning. Days passed and the world finally went quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't demand anything from me. No calls, no endless voicemails, no emotional debt disguised as love. Just silence. When I woke that morning, light spilled through the blinds in thin, soft lines. The candle on my nightstand had melted down to wax and shadow. I sat up slowly, noticing the calm hum of the heater, the faint smell of coffee from the night before. The phone on the table was still, but when I picked it up, a new notification glowed on the screen. Voicemail, Dad. His voice was softer this time, stripped of pride. "They're putting the house up for inspection. Your mom can't sleep. I don't know what to tell her anymore." I listened once, then deleted it. The guilt that used to knot in my stomach didn't rise. Instead, there was only recognition. What was falling apart had never belonged to me to repair. I poured myself coffee and watched the steam curl into the morning air. The city outside sparkled under a thin blanket of ice. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of their expectations pressing against my chest. The phone buzzed again, but I didn't reach for it. I opened my notebook instead and wrote, "Silence doesn't hurt anymore. It just feels like truth." I smiled faintly. Truth was heavy, but at least it was real. Later that morning, the screen lit up again, an unfamiliar number. For a second, I thought about ignoring it, but something in me hesitated. I pressed accept. Grace, the voice, was small, uncertain. Sophie, my sister. I hadn't heard from her in months, not since Christmas 2 years ago. "Hi," I said quietly. She exhaled shakily. "Mom's not talking to anyone. Dad's packing things. The house looks empty." "I didn't know," her voice cracked. "I didn't know you were paying for everything. I'm sorry." Her words hung there, soft but sharp. I leaned against the counter, staring at the snow outside. "You didn't know because they didn't want you to," I said. "They needed me to look responsible and you to stay innocent. It was easier that way." There was silence on the other end. Then a whisper, "I want to understand." I closed my eyes, then start by listening. We stayed on the phone for a long time, neither of us saying much. I could hear the wind on her end, the faint creak of the old house. When we finally hung up, I felt something shift, small but certain. Maybe understanding didn't need explanations. Maybe silence was the start of truth. That night, memories came uninvited. The last Christmas I'd spent at home. Mom had arranged everything perfectly, the lights, the tree, the food she'd pretended to cook herself. I'd wrapped all the gifts, stayed up half the night decorating, paid for half the groceries, and smiled through the exhaustion because that was what daughters were supposed to do. When guests arrived, Mom had smiled proudly. "We're doing so well this year," she'd said. "The business is thriving." No mention of the late payments I'd quietly fixed. No mention of me at all. I remembered sitting in that living room, the smell of cinnamon candles and roast ham, watching her pour wine and laugh like the world had never cracked beneath her feet. It was that night, as she bragged to her friends, that I'd realized I wasn't part of the family story. I was the invisible scaffolding holding it up. Now that scaffolding was gone, and they were finally learning what gravity felt like. I whispered to the empty apartment, "You only miss me now because I stopped being useful." The next afternoon, 2 new voicemails appeared. I listened to both. Dad's voice, first low and tired. "We're talking to the realtor tomorrow. Your mom's not eating. I wish things had been different." Then Mom's, brittle and trembling. "Grace, please. I can't face people anymore. The church knows. I can't go outside. I didn't delete them this time. I just let them sit there. Not as wounds, but as proof." I opened my notebook and wrote, "Forgiveness isn't an answer. It's a choice not to carry their weight anymore." The words looked heavy, but for once they didn't crush me. When evening came, Nora stopped by. She didn't knock loudly, just slipped in like she'd always belonged there. "I brought tea," she said, holding up a paper bag. We sat by the window, the city lights glowing faintly through the frost. She poured the tea, her movements calm and unhurried. "You look lighter," she said finally. "I guess I am," I said. "They're losing everything and I can't bring myself to feel bad." Nora took a slow sip. "You shouldn't. You didn't ruin them. You just stopped protecting their lie." "It doesn't feel like a gift," I murmured. "Maybe not yet," she said softly. "But it's freedom for you and them." I looked out at the falling snow. The flakes caught the streetlights, spinning like small sparks before melting into the dark. "Freedom feels strange. So does healing," Nora said. We smiled at each other, the kind of quiet understanding that doesn't need words. When she left, the apartment felt warm. I cleaned up the mugs, folded the blanket on the couch, and turned off the lights. Before heading to bed, I checked my phone one last time. A new message. "Sophie again. They're scared, Grace. They don't know what to do." I typed a reply, then paused. My fingers hovered above the screen. For once, I didn't write something sharp or distant, I wrote instead, tell them to sell the house before it owns them completely. It wasn't pity. It was honesty, the kind that still carried a trace of mercy. Her response came quickly. Thank you. I'll tell them. I set the phone down and exhaled. It was the first act of kindness that didn't feel like a transaction. The next morning I went for a walk. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs, the sidewalks glittering with ice. The park near my apartment was nearly empty. I sat on a bench watching a child drag a red sled across the snow. His laughter echoed sharp and pure. I realized how long it had been since I'd laughed like that. I tilted my head back, watching the sky. The clouds had broken apart, revealing streaks of pale blue. I whispered to myself, they lost their house. I found my home. The words hung in the cold air, soft but steady. When I returned to the apartment, everything was still. The city hummed faintly below my window. I brewed tea, lit a candle, and opened my notebook one last time that day. The page was blank, clean, waiting. I wrote slowly, deliberately. Silence began as revenge. Now it's peace. I set the pen down, closed the book, and let my hand rest on its cover. The candle flickered beside it, casting a soft golden light across the page. Outside, the wind whispered through the snow-dusted trees. Inside, the air was warm, the quiet complete. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was holding anyone up. I was simply standing on my own, and enough. The call came just after sunrise. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand, a faint vibration that broke the quiet. I almost ignored it until I saw the name Sophie. I pressed play on her voicemail. Grace, she said softly, her voice trembling. They're selling the house. The sign's already up. Mom can't even watch. Dad says he's tired of pretending. I thought you should know. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the wall as the words sank in. I should have felt triumphant. For years, that house had been their altar, every holiday, every argument, every lie polished and displayed beneath its roof. But all I felt was something quieter, heavier, softer. Relief. The kind that comes when you realize the storm has passed, even if everything it touched is gone. The steam from my coffee rose into the light. I played the message again, not to hear Sophie's voice, but to listen to the stillness between her sentences, the hollow silence of a home finally emptied. You didn't fail, I wanted to tell them. You just refused to see what held you up. The thought wasn't cruel, it was mercy in disguise. I opened the window a crack, letting the morning air slip in. The wind carried the scent of frost and something faintly sweet like pine. For the first time, the thought of that house didn't make my chest tighten. It was just a place now, a structure built on borrowed time and borrowed money. I leaned back in the chair and remembered the day it became ours. I was 24, standing beside Dad in the driveway. The for sale sign was still planted in the grass, its corners flapping in the wind. The house was big, freshly painted, and far beyond what they could afford. But Dad's eyes gleamed like a boy's. This will be ours one day, he'd said, voice full of pride. It was bought with loans, not savings. And for years it had been maintained not by them but by me. Every repaired roof, every replaced furnace, every mortgage payment that never bore my name. I could still see my mother's Christmas lights in perfect lines across the porch lights I'd ordered, strung, and paid for. Every corner of that house had a piece of me hidden in it, and none of them ever noticed. Now it was all being boxed up and sold to strangers. The phone rang again around noon. This time I answered. Grace, Mom said, her voice fragile and small. We signed the papers this morning. The realtor says it'll close next month. I didn't say anything at first. The silence stretched between us long enough for me to hear the faint sound of her breath catching. Your father's ashamed, she said finally. I can't sleep. I keep thinking of all the things we could have done differently. I exhaled slowly. You could have told the truth, I said. The line went quiet again. Then I heard her crying, the sound so soft I almost missed it. Do you hate us? She asked. I looked out the window. The snow was melting under the sun, small rivers forming along the curb. No, I said softly, but I don't need you to love me the way you did before either. She didn't answer. There was only breathing slow and uneven before the call ended. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the radiator. The air felt lighter, like something uncoiled had finally left the room. That evening, I got one more voicemail. Dad's voice low and calm this time. "We're moving into a small rental outside Boise. It's nothing like before, but it's enough. Your mom says it feels temporary. I think it feels honest." I smiled faintly. "That's a start," I whispered. Honesty. It had taken the collapse of everything to find it, but maybe that was the price. A week later, I drove past the old neighborhood. The road curved around the same maple trees, the same pale fences, the same lawns I used to mow on weekends when Dad's back was acting up. The house looked smaller than I remembered. There was a for sale sign in the yard, its red letters faded by the Sunday I parked across the street and rolled the window down. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold earth. For a moment, I let myself imagine the echoes inside the clink of Christmas dishes, the muffled sound of my mother laughing at something on TV, the hollow creak of the hallway floorboards when I used to sneak out for air. I didn't cry. I just whispered goodbye. A lightness spread through me, slow and steady. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. Sitting there, I remembered another night years ago when I'd driven away from this same house after another argument. Mom had called me dramatic. Dad hadn't said a word. I'd cried all the way to the freeway, gripping the steering wheel until my fingers went numb. That was the night I promised myself I'd never let them break me again. Now parked in the same spot, I realized they never could. The wind picked up, scattering a few dead leaves across the porch. I started the car, watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. When I got home, the sun was low, casting long amber shadows across the apartment floor. I lit a candle and opened my black notebook. The pages were nearly full columns of numbers, half-finished thoughts, fragments of grief turned into lessons. On the last page I wrote, "The house was built on debt. My peace was built on truth." I didn't destroy them. I stopped pretending to hold them together. I closed the notebook and slid it into the drawer. The sound of it shutting was quiet but final. Outside, the city glowed in the dusk. I walked to the window, the candle flickering beside me, its flame mirrored in the glass. For a moment, I saw two versions of myself, the one who had lived for others and the one who had finally chosen herself. My phone buzzed once more. A text from Sophie. "They're moving tomorrow. Mom said the house feels strange without you." I typed back, "It feels strange because it's finally honest." Then I set the phone down and watched the candlelight waver. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the heater and the city breathing outside. I thought of everything the house had taken: time, money, love twisted into duty. But it had given me something too, the lesson of limits. The understanding that love without truth is just debt by another name. I blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward, then vanished. In the dark, I could see my reflection faintly against the window. Not the daughter who gave too much, not the woman trying to fix what was never hers. Just me. Whole. Standing. Free. "Some houses fall," I whispered, "to make room for new ones." Outside, the night settled around the city like a blanket. For the first time in years, I felt ready for whatever came next. A week passed after the sale. The quiet in my apartment had turned from strange to familiar, like an old song that finally stopped haunting me. I woke early every morning, made coffee, opened the blinds, and sat in the soft light with no sound but the city breathing outside. For once, nothing demanded my attention. I had learned how to exist in stillness. Then one morning my phone rang. The sound startled me. It wasn't Sophie this time. The number looked half familiar, like something I used to know but had tried to forget. My father. I hesitated, staring at it until the ringing nearly stopped. At the last second, I answered. Grace, his voice was low, rough, almost careful. "Yes," I said. There was a pause. "We're in the new place now." Small but quiet. I waited for the next line, the request. The guilt, the subtle twist of obligation, but it didn't come. Your mom's different, he said. We both are. I didn't know what to say. I just wanted to hear your voice, he added softly. And to tell you, we're sorry. For all of it. The words landed between us like fragile glass. I hadn't realized how much I'd wanted to hear them until they were there. My throat tightened. He kept speaking slower now. We thought we were protecting you, you know, making things easier. Easier. The word echoed through me like a memory. I know, I said quietly. There was another long silence. Then he sighed almost in relief. You sound okay. I am, I said. Finally. He didn't say goodbye. He just handed the phone over. When Mom's voice came on, it sounded smaller than I remembered, trembling around the edges. Grace, I'm here. I don't know how to start, she said, her voice breaking a little. I thought I was protecting the family. I see now I was just protecting my pride. I said nothing. I wanted everyone to think we had it together, she went on. Even when we didn't. I used you as proof that we were doing fine. You worked so hard and I let you carry us because it was easier than admitting we needed you. The honesty in her tone caught me off guard. I didn't trust it at first, but I didn't hear manipulation. I heard exhaustion. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, she whispered, but I wanted to say it anyway. I closed my eyes. Thank you, I said. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The quiet that filled the line wasn't tense or bitter. It felt like air after a storm, thick, humid, but alive. Finally, she said, Do you hate us? I looked out the window. The sun was just rising, throwing light across the snow-covered rooftops. No, I said softly, but I don't need you to love me the way you did before either. She didn't answer. I could hear her breathing slow, unsteady. Somewhere deep inside, something unclenched. I thought of the last time I'd seen them years ago. I'd stood on the porch with a suitcase in my hand, tears freezing on my face. Mom had said, You'll come back. You always do. Dad had stayed quiet. That night I'd driven away without saying goodbye. For years that memory burned like a wound. But now, as her breathing steadied through the line, it didn't hurt anymore. It was just a story that had already ended. We talked for a few more minutes about simple things, the weather, the new place, how Sophie was doing. No confessions, no begging, just small talk, ordinary. Before we hung up, Dad came back on the phone. His voice was soft, tired, but lighter somehow. Take care of yourself, Grace. You've earned it. I smiled faintly. You too, Dad. The call ended with a click. The silence that followed felt full, not empty. I sat there for a long time, phone still in my hand, staring at nothing. The world outside my window was gray and still. I wasn't crying, but my chest ached, in a way that wasn't pain, it was release. We can't rebuild the past, I whispered to myself, but maybe we can stop running from it. I opened my notebook, the same black one that had carried all my plans, my rage, my realizations. On a blank page, I wrote, Forgiveness doesn't mean return, it means release. The ink bled slightly, but I didn't blot it. The imperfection felt right. A few days later, I drove to see the house. They'd moved into a small rental on the edge of town. It sat on a quiet street lined with bare trees. The curtains were drawn, the lights off. I didn't go to the door. I didn't need to. I left a small box on the porch, a framed photo of the four of us from a summer years ago, before everything became so complicated. Inside, I tucked a short note, for the truth that came too late, and the peace that came anyway. I stood there for a moment, feeling the wind bite at my face, then turned and walked away without knocking. The drive home felt different. Lighter. The road stretched out before me like something waiting to be rewritten. That night, I lit a candle on the windowsill and sat beside it. The flame flickered, reflecting against the glass. The city lights blinked faintly in the distance, steady as my breath. The phone buzzed once, a text from Sophie. They got the box, Mom cried. Dad said thank you. They'll be okay. I typed back, I know. Then set the phone aside. I opened my notebook again and wrote one last line for the day. They lost their house but found their truth. I lost my anger and found mine. The words glowed faintly in the candlelight. I closed the notebook and set it beside me. The room was quiet, but not empty. The silence hummed with something new, something alive. I sat there until the candle burned low, thinking about how strange it was to end a story without fire or fury. Just a phone call, just a few honest words. Outside, the snow had stopped. The streets were still. I stood by the window, watching the reflection of the flame tremble against the glass. For the first time, I didn't feel like the daughter who had been forgotten, or the woman who had taken revenge. I felt like someone who had finally let go. I blew out the candle, and in the darkness that followed, I whispered, "This is what peace sounds like." It's been a month since the final call. The snow has melted, and the city outside my window hums with the sound of spring buses, laughter dogs barking down the street. The same noise that used to overwhelm me now feels distant, like a melody I don't have to control anymore. I wake up early, make coffee, and let the light spill across the kitchen floor. Nothing demands me. Nothing drains me. There's a small plant on the windowsill that I've somehow managed to keep alive. I water it every morning, even talk to it sometimes. It sounds ridiculous, but keeping something alive that isn't built on obligation feels new. Maybe peace isn't a grand thing. Maybe it's a quiet morning and the sound of a kettle whistling. My inbox flashes one unread email. The subject line reads, "Mortgage account permanently closed." I click it, open, scan the message, then delete it. No hesitation, no guilt, just closure. The phone rings, once breaking the silence. It's Sophie. She calls every Sunday now, not because she needs anything, but because she wants to. "Guess who finally got a job?" she says, her voice bright. I smile. "You did full-time, marketing assistant. They're actually paying me to talk to people." "That sounds like your dream," I tease. She laughs. "Mom and Dad are adjusting. Mom's learning to budget. Dad fixed a broken cabinet last week and didn't call you for help. You'd be proud." "I am," I say softly. There's a small pause before she adds, "You know, I finally get it, Grace. You weren't being cold. You were teaching us to stand." I blink back, the sudden sting in my eyes. I was teaching myself too. We both laugh, and the sound fills the room, light, unforced, real. When we hang up, I sit there for a while, smiling at the phone. The air feels lighter, like it's been cleaned of old ghosts. Outside, the morning is warm enough for a walk. I slip on my jacket and wander through the streets near the coast. The air smells of salt and sunlight. Seagulls cut across the sky, their wings flashing white against blue. I stop at a small cafe, the kind that always has mismatched chairs and cinnamon in the air. The barista remembers my order: black coffee, no sugar. As I wait, I notice a family by the window, parents laughing as their toddler smashes a muffin into crumbs. A year ago, the sight would have twisted something in me. Now I just smile. Life continues. Families learn, break, and rebuild. Some slowly, some not at all. When I return home, I sit at my desk, the same one that once held piles of unpaid bills, old receipts, and a list of everything I owed them. It's empty now. Only my black notebook remains, its cover worn smooth. I flip to the last page, the one I never finished. Across the top in my handwriting it says, "Forgiveness means release." I trace the words with my fingertip. They feel like someone else's now, a version of me that fought harder than she needed to. I tear out the page and fold it neatly. On my shelf there's a glass jar filled with things that mark the end of that chapter: the candle stub from Sedona, a seashell from the beach, a photo of my parents' old house before it's sold. I slip the folded paper inside and close the lid. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means knowing what to keep. Later that afternoon, I walk by the ocean. The waves roll in slow curling and breaking with a sound like breath. I stand at the edge where the water meets the sand and close my eyes. The breeze tangles my hair, and for the first time the silence inside me feels alive. In the distance, a father lifts his child onto his shoulders. A mother waves, snapping a photo. I watch them for a while and realize something simple: I don't envy them. I don't even miss what I thought I lost. The kind of love I used to chase doesn't live in houses or holidays. It lives in honesty and peace, in the courage to stop pretending. I pick up a small seashell and hold it to my ear. The sound of the ocean hums through it, deep and endless. This time I whisper, the silence belongs to me. When I get home, the light has turned gold. The air smells faintly of rain and warmth. I sit at the kitchen table, take out a blank sheet of paper, and begin to write. Dear me. You did not fail for walking away. You simply stopped mistaking sacrifice for love. You are allowed to choose peace over guilt and silence over noise. You don't owe anyone a home or an explanation. You owe yourself the life they never let you have. I fold the letter and write across the front for when I forget. I tuck it into a drawer and close it gently. A small laugh escapes me. For once, I'm not closing a door out of anger. I'm just done living in the same room as pain. That night, I light a new candle. It's white, labeled renewal. The flame flickers softly, casting warm shadows on the wall. I sit by the window, watching the city breathe beneath me. For a moment, I imagine turning to you, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from, and I wonder if you've ever felt this way. For years, I thought silence was loneliness. I thought being the good daughter, the fixer, the reliable one would earn me love. But it only earned me exhaustion. I carried everyone until there was nothing left of me. Maybe you've done that too. Maybe you've poured yourself so thin for people who never noticed until you stopped. If you have, if you've ever chosen quiet, not because you gave up, but because you finally understood your worth, I want you to know you're not alone. Tell me, have you ever been the one who held everything together until it broke you? Have you ever had to let go to survive? Share your story below. Maybe someone else needs to hear it. Maybe you do. And if my story reminded you of your own stay, there are more stories like this, stories about justice, healing, and the quiet kind of revenge that rebuilds your soul instead of breaking it. Sometimes the truth doesn't scream. Sometimes it just whispers, "You're free now." I lean back in my chair and blow out the candle. The smoke curls upward, a soft gray ribbon fading into air. The city outside glows in gold and silver. My reflection in the window is calm, not the daughter erased, not the woman forgotten, but the one who learned to stop disappearing. The story isn't about what I lost, I whisper. It's about what I stopped giving away. The night hums softly, steady as breath. Somewhere far off, a train horn echoes. Life keeps moving. And as the light from the candle fades, I smile, feeling something I haven't in years: peace. The quiet kind that stays.